Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to see everyone. It's my pleasure to call this work session of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality to order. With us today are Commissioners Emily Lindley and Bobby Janecka, as well as our General Counsel. I'm John Neerman. Ms. Smith, I'll have you call the first item.
Item number 1 is the consideration of the agency's post-incident response actions regarding Winter Storm Uri and the related recommendations for improving public water system resiliency.
And I'll invite my colleagues to share any thoughts off the top if you have any. I have none. And
Well, I don't have a whole lot. This was, I think, I don't know if you gentlemen had the same idea, but I know I had the idea to have the work session today, so thanks, everybody, for accommodating. I think we've probably all heard mostly what they're going to present, is my guess, but when we met, I know there were questions on, we asked y'all to put together recommendations, but you kind of need guidance, so I kind of wanted to hear what y'all's thoughts were, and that's why I thought it would be good to have a work session. So,
wonderful.
yeah.
I'm glad to have it. Well, without further ado, let me turn it over to ED staff. L'Oreal, good morning.
Good morning, Chairman, Commissioners, General Counsel, and then the Executive Director staff. Thank you so much. And Commissioners, Winter Storm Uri was unprecedented for the state. You know, we're kind of used to hurricanes and other natural disasters, tornadoes, but this was certainly unprecedented for our entire state. So thank you for asking our staff to look into, you know, how we regulate, how we handle, what processes and procedures we have with our water systems. Our goal is to just always continuing to improve and adjusting to the situations that are presented before us. And so I'm going to turn it over to Earl Lott. He's the director for the Office of Water, and I guess I should say who I am. I'm L'Oreal Stepney. I'm the Deputy Executive Director for the agency. And before I turn it over to Earl, I know we have a lot of our staff who contributed in Austin and in our regional offices, and they're here today, and I just wanted to personally say thank you for all of your contributions and your consideration for the people of Texas and how we can do things better. So thank you. Earl?
Thank you, L'Oreal. Good morning, Commissioners, General Counsel. For the record, I'm Earl Lott, Director of the Office of Water, and we're going to provide an overview of our recommendations from Winter Storm Uri after action storm review. During the week of February 14th, 2021, Winter Storm Uri impacted many of the state's 7,000 public water systems, resulting in power outages, shortages, bursted pipes, and equipment failures, which resulted in impacts to the treatment process. During the event, nearly 40% of the community public water systems were required to issue boil water notices. And during a March 3rd, 2021 Commission work session, the Commission had directed staff to conduct an after action review plan and, evaluate what things worked well and what things need improvement and provide recommendations to improve resiliency of these water systems. And as a result of that, we formed an interagency group consisting of OCE staff as well as Office of Water staff to conduct a deep dive and look at these different issues. And I'm going to turn it over to Brittany Tickle, manager of the Emergency Preparedness and Response section, to just kind of give a highlight of the initial action plan that we came up with. And then Carrie Michelle will cover the recommendations that we want to discuss with you today. So thank you. With that, I'll turn it over to Brittany.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman, Commissioners, and General Counsel. I'm Brittany Wortham-Tickle, and I've been the project manager for the After Action Review. The project team spent the last year reviewing water system resiliency literature, rules and regulations, and gathering information about the storm's impact on the water systems through a public water system survey and roundtable discussions. The survey covered topics relating to system functionality, infrastructure, boil water notices and communication, auxiliary power and emergency preparedness, assistance needs, staffing, and lessons learned. Nearly 400 responses were received. More than half of the survey respondents suggested their operators needed emergency preparation and response training. Respondents also said that staff effort, pre-planning, and the training they did have played the biggest role where they found success in mitigating impacts from the storm. Nearly half, or 182 of the survey respondents, reported losing functionality during the storm. 164 respondents referenced the loss of power as the main reason for the inability to produce, treat, or pump water to customers. Approximately 60% of the respondents reported having broken pipes, which led to significantly higher water usage and water loss, causing system facilities to be drained. And just over half of the respondents stated they did not have a mutual aid agreement for help with response and recovery actions. During the roundtable discussions that occurred over the summer of 2021, the project team discussed issues including critical infrastructure, storm preparation, planning and protection efforts, and emergency response and communication measures. Much of the conversation focused on power outages and losing the ability to operate facilities and pump water. Many stakeholders stated that power surges damaged their electrical components, that they lost heat sources like space heaters and heat tape that they were using for winterization, and were sometimes unable to keep water moving through the lines, and the standing water often froze in the pipes, causing them to rupture. Many stakeholders believe they had been identified as critical load facility with their electrical provider, but still lost power, and there was little to no warning regarding the outages when to expect power to return. In some cases where systems experienced rolling blackouts, they mentioned the time with power was not sufficient to start up and make more water. Representatives from the Public Utility Commission were present at each session to field questions relating to critical load status. The impact from water line leaks was discussed at length, including the impact of water loss from high usage or breaks in internal plumbing. Stakeholders discussed the difficulty of issuing a boil water notice and providing information to customers during the storm and asked for quick and easy to understand instructions. Stakeholders referenced the high volume of calls from frustrated customers looking for information about what they should do and how quickly service was going to be restored. Some stakeholders stated that a lot of customer calls had to go unanswered because all of their resources were out conducting repairs to get the system back online as quickly as possible. Discussions also included the need for additional guidance on how to request assistance or where they could find information on what assistance was available. The Texas Division of Emergency Management provided information on how to request state assistance for emergency conditions and how to find resources to prepare for future events. Because stakeholders voiced the need for additional training to better prepare their water systems for significant weather events, over the last year, the project team developed, coordinated, or participated in roughly 16 trainings and workshops, and will continue to focus on providing additional training events in the future. Throughout the project, the team evaluated relevant water industry literature and regulations of several other states. The information consistently referenced protecting exposed piping from freezing and the importance of a full, usable plant operations manual. While protection from freezing conditions were referenced consistently, very few specific weatherization techniques were provided in rule to allow for the need for site-specific weatherization methods. Several best management practices, guidance, and checklists were identified that will be incorporated into upcoming guidance documents and training. That concludes our project summary, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have about the project team's activities over the past year.
Thank you. I have none. Commissioner Lindley?
Just one quick question. The 16 trainings and workshops you referenced, I'm not looking for a specific number. Was the turnout good? Was there involvement? I mean, I'm just looking to see if we have any idea of who we actually touched, who participated.
Yeah, we had a variety of trainings. We also did some coordination with EPA as well. We did some power resiliency trainings. And so I think, Elston, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we had close to 800 to 1,000 participants across all those trainings. And of course, there was a variety of topics there that they kind of tuned into, but that would be my estimate, as a whole.
Great, thanks.
Bobby?
Can you, I want to confirm, was there Public Utility Commission staff that participated in some of the trainings and workshops?
They participated in our roundtable discussions.
I really appreciate that y'all were able to request and get that participation. I'm grateful for their support. Thanks.
I think that might exhaust our questions at this point. So, Carrie Michelle?
Okay. Good morning. I am Carrie Michelle Kyle. I'm the Deputy Director of the Water Supply Division, and I'm here to present the project team's recommendations. I'd like to thank the village of team members that are here today. They're a great group of folks to work with, and, they spent a whole lot of hours outside of their day jobs to get these recommendations put together. So very grateful for their participation. I'd also like to thank all the stakeholders that participated in the process. First, our survey was pretty extensive. It took time away from their busy schedules to complete that and get those responses back to us. Also because they were open and honest. They talked to us about the challenges that they had that week, and they're also willing to discuss their system shortcomings, which isn't always easy, especially with a regulatory agency. Other things that they really voiced their concern about was additional costs associated with these recommendations. They talked to us about the high cost of repairs and system improvements that were needed as a result of the storm. They talked about implementation costs for Senate Bill 3 and lingering impacts from the pandemic. The project team was cognizant of this. We worked extremely hard to weigh the cost versus benefit of each of these recommendations. If we move forward with the recommendations, you know, there are going to be some potential costs, but we really tried to strike a balance to help minimize those impacts. We have 14 recommendations to present today. A couple have degrees of stringency, as Commissioner Lindley was discussing, that we'll present, but then we'll also provide the project's team's preferred approach for consideration. There are 3 additional optional ideas for additional recommendations. For the optional ideas, we recognize that there are going to be some challenges associated with those, and more discussion may be needed before including those in our final recommendation. As we work through these, I'd like the opportunity for members of the team to participate in the conversation today, since they are the subject matter experts. We have an empty chair at the end of the table, so each member who worked on a particular recommendation can join where appropriate to answer questions and provide necessary background. And we also consulted with other areas in the agency during the project, and so they are also here to answer any questions that you may have. All right, well, if there are no objections, I'll kind of roll through all the recommendations, and then we can kind of go from there. All right. Our first recommendation is to require resiliency training as a prerequisite for operator licensure. Stakeholders, as Brittany mentioned, emphasize the need for more resiliency training. This type of training is currently not included in licensure requirements. The current curriculum will be revised to include tools to enhance emergency preparedness, response, and recovery tactics to help ensure effective preparation and response for an extreme weather event or other emergency condition. These requirements will be included in the operator's core initial training, as well as operators' continuing education requirements. Until a new rule can be adopted to add resiliency as part of the core curriculum requirements for the new licenses, the licensing policy will be revised with an appropriate grace period for the current licensing cycle to require all current licensees seeking continuing education credits to take a resiliency training as part of their continuing education hours. This policy change will serve as an interim method for ensuring operators are receiving this training. In addition to updating the policy and adopting new resiliency training options for continuing education and core curriculum courses for new licenses will be developed. Our second recommendation.
I have a question too, real quick.
Sure.
So just to confirm, so if this is a requirement, that's what we're saying, and then you're saying if it doesn't happen, well, let me back up. This is the plan, an interim plan until a rule is adopted, and you know, the rule, who knows what it'll look like, I guess eventually. I would think pretty similar to what's proposed, but we'll see. Is that right so far? Am I understanding that right? That this is gonna be the requirement in the interim until a rule is done?
The rule will make anyone coming in for a new license.
Okay.
They'll have to have that part of their core curriculum training.
Okay,
But for right now, until that rule is adopted, we'll go ahead and have all of that in a continuing education format.
Okay.
So that they have the option to choose that to meet the continuing education requirements.
oh, come on up, Wyatt. And if they don't, is ultimate, you get your license revoked? I mean, I guess that's the case if you don't do your continuing education requirements anyway, but is that the ultimate slap we have, for lack of a better term?
So basically, just kind of to expand on what Carrie Michelle said, we currently have both under statute and rule the authority to expand the requirements for the licensure. So we can do it not only on guidance, but we have the authority to do so. So what the ultimate goal would be is like a two-tier approach, like Carrie Michelle was alluding to, a short term and a long term. In the short term, the continuing education credits would be relatively easy because we already have some resiliency training out there that is approved. They have to have 30 hours of continuing education credits every 3 years, and we can immediately, by immediately I mean in a short order, change the requirement to maybe make 2 of those credits at least be resiliency related. Now, the core curriculum for new licenses, even in the absence of the rulemaking, in advance of the rulemaking, we could immediately start doing what we call a training recall, where we would notify all the training providers that their training curriculum is no longer satisfying the requirements, and they're going to need to revamp that training, give them like 6 months to revamp the training to include resiliency as part of their modules. We can start with the entry-level license, the basic water, and then go into the more advanced water courses for groundwater and surface water. And then they would have, in the interim, they could have an option of taking a standalone module that they also would do for continuing educations, but they can do that in addition to the core training. And then once the core trainings are revamped, and then we revise the curriculum, and the training providers send the revised training, and we approve it, then they will be included in that packet. So that's how. And then at the end of the day, the rule will just memorialize this concept, but we already have the authority to implement that. So yes, the license would be not issued unless this requirement is met.
Very helpful, thanks.
I had a related question. In terms of the rulemaking itself, we would anticipate proposing that when, and I think I'm talking more broadly about all of the recommendations. What do we foresee the process going? So Haya, this isn't really a question for you, I don't think so.
Well, we have rulemaking in relation to Senate Bill 3, and so we will start that process, late summer after we get through the horde of EPPs that we're going to have to review. And once we get footing on that, we'll start that rulemaking process. So a lot of what we're talking about today can be incorporated into that rule package.
Okay. And some of the efforts, not only for this recommendation, but others, we will have rolling in motion ahead of time, and then the rule will ultimately catch up to that, I guess. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Anything else for me?
Do we have a reasonable set of tools for flexibility to give the operators who, for whatever circumstance, the one class between them and when their renewal time period would have come for that 3-year due date, are we pretty flexible that we can easily accommodate individual circumstances?
Yes, absolutely. We'll give plenty of time for the courses to be revised and then for people to come into compliance, and we'll have a period of time where people are going to be in the middle of the requirements, and then we just need to keep things moving. Absolutely. And then it's going to also depend on how quickly the training providers can revamp these courses and create new ones.
I appreciate that. And the existing resiliency courses that are offered now, are they satisfactory to the need of that subject area, or is that something that we're maybe wanting to just bulk up generally, or they do for now?
We do, and we talk a little bit about that in our next recommendation. So, all right, for our second recommendation is to develop new and revise existing resiliency training for water system personnel. So new emergency preparedness training and tabletop exercises are going to be developed to help ensure continuity of operations during these emergency events. We'll also refresh existing resiliency training to ensure any lessons learned from the winter storm are incorporated as needed. Training will be provided through on-site system visits, workshops, YouTube, webinars, and conferences. Direct assistance modules will be developed by our Texas Optimization and Emergency Preparedness programs, as well as offering additional training opportunities through technical assistance providers. Other opportunities to promote training will also include a dedicated track for case studies and lessons learned at a future agency public drinking water conferences and trade fairs. We'll look for opportunities to promote our local emergency planning committees. These are the folks that plan tabletop exercises with area utilities and local officials. We'll enhance coordination with the Division of Emergency Management on emergency preparedness training events with a focus on training designed to introduce county judges, commissioners, mayors, and city council members, and other elected and appointed officials to emergency management in Texas. We'll also enhance coordination with the Texas Water Development Board to further promote resources to understand and mitigate water loss, including leak detection and repair, as well as expanding the available technical assistance modules for evaluating water loss and improving water loss control. So to answer your question, we are going to take a refresh. You know, any time that you provide training, you always want to keep that up to date, especially with all the lessons learned from these events.
Karen Michelle, I'm just gonna make kind of a comment, because I jot down to just say it. It would come up organically, I'll say it that way, so I'll just go ahead and say it now. And I don't expect you to have the answer right now, because we're only on recommendation number 2, and I know there's some that don't even have a number, but one of the things I'm probably most passionate about all this, and I've said this at other work sessions, is what resources do they need, right, in order to get this done? I mean, I don't want you to be shy about ever letting us know what's needed. And, you know, I think it's a pretty good argument this would benefit the whole state, making sure that the water systems have the accurate training and all that kind of stuff they need. So if whatever the resources might be, right, maybe it's not people, maybe it is, maybe it's, I don't know, we always need IT money, whatever it might be. Eventually, I'm going to want to know that. And Office of Water, as well as all the folks in the audience, are already super overworked. But I think this needs to be a big priority moving forward. So we just need to know. So one day, maybe it's better in a briefing, not necessarily at a work session or whatever. I just want to know what the cost might be of all this. So I think we probably all feel that way. And I would have said it eventually, but I'm just going to go ahead and make it known now.
And Commissioner, thank you for those comments, because you're right. Our drinking water staff in Karen Michelle's shop, as well as our regional staff, there's lots of new requirements and that they have to deal with, this in addition to their core mission, which is reviewing plans and specifications and looking at compliance for drinking water facilities. So
On top of lead and copper, on top of,
yeah, there's a whole, and
Yeah.
there's probably 6 or 7 other state and federal initiatives that they are responsible for. And of course, like the rest of state government, we're seeing a lot of folks move on for other opportunities or retirement or whatever. And so thank you for saying that. Certainly we'll have to look at the resource needs for that division. It's very critical to the agency, protecting drinking water.
Right.
I mean, there's nothing else more fundamental, so thank you.
Okay, our third recommendation kind of piggybacks on what we were discussing, and it's to build a specialized team in the Water Supply Division to assist operators perform on-site resiliency assessments and recommend additional measures to harden water system infrastructure. So what we'll do here is we'll use existing resources that were granted to the agency through the passage of Senate Bill 3, who will be trained to perform on-site resiliency assessments relating to emergency preparedness. The team will provide recommendations, if warranted, to improve resiliency and emergency response actions. The team will assist systems with implementation of their emergency preparedness plans and other specialized technical support to enhance system resiliency. The new team will also help ensure the agency has additional resources with the expertise to assist water systems before, during, and after a catastrophic weather event. Moving on to our fourth recommendation is to develop training for the operation and maintenance of generators. So stakeholders requested specialized training on choosing, using, maintaining, and testing of a generator. To develop the training, staff will need to collaborate with maintenance companies and other field experts to develop hands-on training for water system personnel. In addition to the training, we'll develop a maintenance checklist that can be used by operators, and we'll look for opportunities to present the training, and we'll work with the licensing program to incorporate this training into the curriculum as an option for operators' continuing education requirements. Our fifth recommendation is to develop a one-stop guidance manual for all weather hazards and associated requirements that will include bottled boil water notice procedures and best management practices. Stakeholders noted that additional guidance documents were needed to clarify best practices for preparing for or responding to emergencies. They stated although the agency had guidance available, it wasn't in one place or easily to reference during an emergency. This guidance manual will act as a single, easy-to-use document that outlines preparation and response methods to help ensure a smoother response when an emergency occurs. The contents of the manual will be reviewed periodically and updated as needed and can act as a supplement to the Systems Plant Operations Manual. The guidance will have templates and step-by-step instructions for operators to follow, such as issuing and rescinding boil water notices or other critical protocols. We'll continue to coordinate with stakeholders during development of the manual to ensure that the manual will meet their needs. So we're going to talk about our first optional idea for a recommendation, okay? And this is for additional training requirement. And that is to require the National Incident Management System Incident Command Structure introductory training for owners and operators of public water systems. And this is going to include levels 100, 200, 700, and 800. Just to give you some background of what that is, the National Incident Management System is a kind of a unified approach to incident management. It establishes a standard command and a management structure, and it emphasizes preparedness, mutual aid, and resource management. The Incident Command System is a standardized, on-scene, all-hazards incident management concept that allows its users to adopt an integrated organizational structure that is adaptable to single or multiple incidents and offers a scalable response to an emergency of any magnitude. It pretty much provides a common framework within which responders from multiple agencies can work together. The training is free, it's a self-study, and it's a course that's routinely taken online and provided by FEMA. If this training were required for water system personnel, the agency would need statutory authority to implement. We included this as an optional idea because requiring this training does present some challenges. One discussion that we had was this training requirement really needed for all public water systems? Texas Division of Emergency Management already has this as a training requirement for specific emergency management personnel, including municipal water systems. We also grappled with the necessity of this type of training for a very small water system, which makes up the majority of our systems here in Texas. If required, we'll have some difficulty with documenting completion of each course to be able to approve continuing education credits due to the independent study format of these courses. The courses are lengthy and would take a considerable portion of continuing education hours to complete, potentially impacting other continuing education opportunities. After extensive discussion within the team, we all believe that this training is beneficial, okay? However, we feel the best approach is to incorporate aspects of NIMS and ICS training into core course requirements that we talked about in our first recommendation. We develop a framework for training providers to introduce these key concepts into an operator's license core courses as part of their core resiliency training criteria. Course content would include basic structure of the ICS while providing a foundation for higher level ICS training. Course content would also provide a basic understanding of NIMS concepts, principles, and explain the relationship between NIMS and ICS. Moving to our sixth recommendation, and I'm sorry, Toby,
Should we pause? Are you looking
Sure.
are you looking for feedback on the optional ideas at this point?
I think it's up to you on whether or not you want to go ahead and start that discussion, or, if you'd like us to go back and.
I think if we all have thoughts, we need to say them now, right? My original idea was, y'all come present, we chat about it. We might not be able to make all the decisions today, and we need to come back. But I do want this to move. I've said that as well. So I do think out of probably, I'll just start since I have the mic on. Out of the 3 additional recommendations, I think this one's probably the hardest, just for me. Where I probably shouldn't speak from where my head's at, but I'm just going to. My initial knee-jerk reaction is, yeah, and let's go get statutory authority, because I'm fearful of God forbid, another winter storm like this, and citizens don't have water, and someone looks to us and says, why weren't you on top of this? And, you know, I don't know what our answer would be right off the top of my head right now. But I also really, really appreciate the considerations y'all have taken, and I think I like the idea of incorporating pieces of it into the training. I just don't know off the top of my head, and if anyone else has thoughts, I'd love to hear them on if that's enough. And I will also say, if we were to seek statutory authority and, demand this basically of public water system personnel, the issue of how do we track it seems extremely complicated, and I don't want our agency to be given statutory authority to do something and then it be impossible for us to do, because I think that would be a vulnerability for us. So I really think y'all have thought long and hard about it, and I like the idea of incorporating pieces. I don't know. I'll stop there and see if anyone else has thoughts for now.
Well, I also like where you landed with that in terms of presenting sort of the high-level concepts and how it works, introducing people to the system in the core curriculum. I think we all agree it would be great if every operator did have the full training. But in addition to the problems that you identified, we also have a problem even having a qualified operator at many of these systems, and I wouldn't want this to be another reason why there's not a qualified licensed operator at a system. So
That's a great point. And you said this, and I meant to say it, but, maybe we need to think through, and I would welcome stakeholder thoughts on this as well. Do we look at setting a threshold, X amount of systems? Because, there are thousands of tiny systems. I don't know. I don't know if that would actually solve a problem or not, but that's just something I was thinking on when you said as well. I don't know.
Well, it sounds like there may be a threshold built in already in terms of municipal water suppliers already are already required to have the training, I think is what I heard, right? So that's a kind of a threshold. So, it would be a decision for us. Do we want to recommend legislation to move that threshold down to smaller systems? And how far down do you go? Which it's a question I don't intend to resolve today, but
I think I'm in agreement with all the pressure points y'all highlighted and the compliments on hitting the right balancing point at the start. I think trying to grab the essential pieces of that core introductory course, the real value in my eyes is making sure that the incident command structure, the national NIMS, National Incident Command System, ICS and NIMS, National Incident Management System, I think that those are really incredibly valuable, just local responder fluency things. I'm not immediately sure where the obvious need is, and I'm sure that there will exist a variety of different circumstances and opportunities to have water system operators or those staff who may participate in the training to end up in the seats in a local incident response structure. And this is a incredibly relevant and broad-reaching fluency to develop. I was just able to observe a little of the activities that are going around Austin this week. The federal government, state and local actors have all come together for a big radioactive materials disaster policy simulation, a tabletop where they're utilizing the incident command structure and NIMS to grab in all of the different participating agencies and plug them in exactly that system. So one unintended consequence here is that we should all be mindful of is that our water system operators scattered across the state may slowly but surely start to get plucked up and moved to other places as this fluency that they may develop in response to the need in their smaller systems makes them a little more attractive to other employers in different places. And so I think that that's a valuable thing that we wouldn't be necessarily grading ourselves on, but the state would benefit from. So maybe starting with where y'all have landed and using using sunlight, public attention as best we can to help celebrate those smaller systems that manage to get their staff into these trainings. I know these are really intensive and they take a lot of time. I tried to get in a couple of different places as staff. I felt like I was trapped in the permitting side of the agency and I couldn't get out and do emergency response stuff. So I wanted to go to participate in this sort of training to have an excuse and couldn't break away for that time commitment. I know there's a lot of opportunities where there's a lot of support for local public servants of all walks of life to find their way into these trainings without cost to the organization, but that's still a real intensive thing. And I think given quite a few public educators in my life and family, I think many of them are all reeling over this last year of a lot of really valuable reading education that they've been intensively getting to do a graduate level course in on their free time. And that really was one tremendously added pressure on all of their shoulders over this last year that I appreciate would definitely add another burden onto the backs of many of our operators who are responding to the resiliency and the generator training and the other new offerings. So this is something that I think is really valuable, but I'm not as nervous if we're not rushing headlong into seeking that statutory authority, so long as we're mindful of the new need in the smaller systems and trying to add more spotlight to that. I think what you're doing now is exactly where we're going to land.
Thank you. Moving on to our sixth recommendation, and we're kind of over the hub of training. Again, you know, the group thought that was very important, and certainly stakeholders were very receptive to any additional training that was going to be developed. Sixth recommendation is to add additional maintenance requirements for generators, okay? This was a very interesting conversation with our stakeholders, and they readily acknowledged that they needed to perform more frequent or effective generator maintenance procedures. Stakeholders believe that more generators would have remained operational during the winter storm if systems were sufficiently educated in generator maintenance, operations, and understood how to test the generators under load. A revision to Chapter 290 rules would include additional maintenance procedures for generators, which could include, and at the beginning I had talked a little bit about degrees of stringency, and here's where we've got some ideas and possibly looking for some feedback, and then we'll present, again, our preferred approach. You know, if we design minimum maintenance, this is going to require critical preventative maintenance measures such as maintaining automatic transfer switches, free of dirt and debris, checking connections, replacing contacts when required, checking contacts for erosion and overheating, those sorts of things. We'll establish a minimum maintenance frequency, and this will require that a professional inspect the generators and equipment, and at least once every 3 years or more frequently if it's specified in the manufacturer's specifications, in addition to an annual maintenance conducted by water system personnel. A professional could include a licensed electrician or a mechanic or a certified generator maintenance company. We also want to talk about minimum maintenance certification. Require certification or records to be maintained on site confirming that the required maintenance was conducted for review during TCEQ scheduled inspections, or tag the generator confirming the generator was inspected by a professional. In addition to any rule changes, we develop guidance to help systems understand the new requirements and a checklist outlining what needs to be evaluated and tested during the maintenance procedure. So I'd like to point out quickly that currently water systems with a generator that serve more than 1,000 connections already perform level 2 maintenance in accordance with the National Fire Protection Association. You know, that covers the installation, maintenance, operation, and testing requirements. The addition of generator maintenance and agency rules would be for the systems with less than 1,000 connections, not currently required to perform this level 2 maintenance. The project team's preferred approach is to include generator maintenance requirements in rule. We all feel that that's very important. But we do not feel that maybe requiring a generator be inspected and tagged by a professional, which could pose a significant cost to a system, is necessarily where we need to be. Instead, we could rely on training, guidance documents, and maintenance checklists to evaluate the generator, and system certification to ensure that the maintenance procedures are performed.
If you don't know, it's fine. any idea what the cost is to an entity to pay a master electrician or whatever might be needed to come do this testing? Does anyone know?
Sure, Clayton, why don't you come on up? He did a lot of research on some of the costs for the maintenance procedures.
Make sure I get this right. Thank you so much, commissioners, executive staff, and council. My name is Clayton Nicolardi. I'm one of the senior engineers with the Texas Optimization Program. So some of you I've seen during emergency events, and it's nice to be able to just sit in here comfortably and discuss this with you guys. Yeah, a proactive rather than reactionary measure. But yes, we did a lot of, to answer your question, Commissioner Lindley, we did a lot of research in terms of trying to identify the potential cost of water systems. So we did break down kind of small, medium, large, and what that might mean to them in terms of maintenance. Maintenance includes, you know, a lot of things like maintaining the generator itself or the transfer switch, or even fuel maintenance. Anytime you have fuel, especially diesel, you know, and it's you've had that stored for 6 months to a year, it gets contaminated with water or, you know, bacteria, and so that has to be taken care of. So for small systems, you know, you may see it may cost $750, say, I think it was on the bottom end of our scale, and that would include a system, maybe 50 connections. And so that would include, you know, maintaining the generator, also, you know, fuel maintenance and things of that nature. The difficulty in trying to identify, you know, specific costs, that's why we did ranges, is that the costs are very variable. So a manufacturer may require annual maintenance, and then some require hourly. So just like a boat engine or a lawnmower that you have, you know, it has an hour meter. And so, you know, the generator may not need an oil change or filter change until, you know, it's operated 150 hours. So we tried to just, you know, use blocks of, you know, ranges of cost for small, medium, and large. For us to really, you know, fine tune that, it's going to require much more research and input, I think, from professionals. You know, that's including your maintenance providers. Now, the thing about maintenance providers is they're really tight-lipped on their charges. You'll almost never be able to go on the internet and say, I want to find out how much maintenance is going to cost me, because maintenance providers, they're making money. They're in the business to make money, and they don't want to share their intellectual knowledge or property with others on the internet. So what they always ask you is, like, I know you guys have run into this before. You ask for a cost, and they say, well, I'll get back with you. Fill out this long, lengthy form of, you know, how many generators you have, you know, what kind of equipment, transfer switches and the like that you have, and then they'll get the professionals together and they'll send you a quote. So from our position, it's more complicated to, you know, narrow that down to a real, so let me, Brittany is sharing this with me. So we looked at, I basically broke down the range 25 to 3,000 population, and you're looking at 750 to 5,000. That was the range that we came up with. 3,001 to 10,000, you're looking at a cost about 5,001 to 8,000. And then, of course, your larger systems, and that would include like Houston and Dallas and the like, 10,001 to a million connections or population, excuse me, that would be 8,001 to 100,000. So I think that we're real comfortable with, you know, water systems falling somewhere within that range. And they may be on the lower side of the range, hopefully. But one of the, I'd like to add something about the maintenance of generators. Something I learned from the 2022 Texas Water Convention in San Antonio this year We had a very large system that was actually going over a case study and lessons learned. And without identifying that system, I'll just tell you it's one of the, the 3 largest cities in a state. But they said they had 70% of their generators were maintained, tested, and operated by third-party generator maintenance companies. The remaining 30% of their generators were in-house maintained. And they indicated that the 30% that were in-house maintained were the ones that were problematic. So that was interesting. That hit me like, because we'd done this research, and this to have somebody get up there and actually, a large system, and actually tell us what they experienced was huge. Did
have a
I answer that question?
Yes, very well. That was more detailed than I thought. I appreciate it.
I'm sorry if I rambled
No,
on, 'cause
no, you are great. And this might not be a question anyone here can answer, but I'm just kind of thinking out loud. Does anybody know if any of the money that the board can give out could ever be used for something like this? And that's a question for the board, but, so you don't have to answer it. If no one feels like they know the answer, you don't have to answer. But I'm just trying to get creative here, because where my mind is at is thinking, people are gonna need to do this. We can't, I mean, I think, I don't know, I think we need to make, I think there are gonna need to be some generator maintenance requirements that we're probably gonna have to make people do. That's kind of where I am right now. But I'm also very cognizant that those costs always get passed on, and we will not make any friends by making this a requirement or asking the ledge to make a requirement or whatever it might be. I'm just trying to think through, could there ever be a way to work with the board? Elston, take it away.
Can I add one clarification on that? Great question. I'd further want to know, have y'all learned anything more about the technical assistance, the new funding for technical assistance specifically, that I'm not at all familiar with water funding, but as I gather is a new thing that federal funding is now going to come down, designating TCQ as the responsible generous party to get to negotiate and decide what technical assistance means. And there's a whole other universe of unanswered questions there that I'm seeing from a blank face is maybe still obscurely lost in federal budgeting morass.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for giving an opportunity to speak. Elston Johnson, representing Water Supply Division. And to answer the first question about the cost and being able to use money from the board to maintain generators, they do have in their intended use plan for this year money set aside to purchase them as an option if you go in and you get SRF funding. But operations and maintenance has always been kind of a sticky issue with SRF funds, and not sure if that's going to be an option. Now, that's not the only funding source that's available, but specific to the board, that would be the issue. There's some other funding from other agencies. They all tend to be more infrastructure related, though, and not necessarily operations and maintenance. And so that's kind of where the problem's going to come.
I don't know. I mean, it almost seems like this is infrastructure. Am I wrong? I don't know. I feel like there's an argument to be, and I'm not trying to, it's just conversation.
Yeah.
I just feel like there might be an argument to be made there that if the state were going to maybe potentially required, these new to some people generator requirements, that seems like infrastructure to me. I don't know. It might be something to sit down with our friends at the board and discuss, or EPA. Maybe that's where we need to go. Elston's shaking his head. It'd be
Yes.
more of an EPA conversation.
Yes,
Yes.
it is.
They set the guidance for what they can do with the money.
Ah, okay, yeah. Okay, I'll stop.
Okay.
And I'm going to just clearly blame the 2% as a future-looking question on where federal monies might put us in new boxes. Earl, I have heard that that's a question that you've been trying to get answers from EPA about all funding. So I'll just continue to look to you on that front. Thanks.
All right, our second optional idea for a recommendation is also relating to generators. And this is to require all public water systems and affected utilities with a generator on site or plan to utilize a generator during severe weather or other emergency conditions, maintain enough fuel on site to operate for 72 hours. Stakeholders initiated multiple discussions regarding fuel quality and quantity. Some water systems stated that they did not have enough fuel on site to power their generator for the duration of the winter storm event. In the survey, most of the respondents stated that they had already maintained 1 to 3 days of fuel on site. And while the best practice for water systems would be to review historical water outage data and plan accordingly based on historical need, the idea of the 72-hour requirement was generally accepted by the stakeholders. Additionally, other water associations recommend water systems maintain 72 hours of fuel on site for emergencies as well. Discussions also included whether the requirement should include adding preservatives and additives to the fuel that will allow the fuel to remain usable and less impacted by freezing temperature during future events. Stakeholders indicated that issues arose with the fuel on site because it was either old or gelled from extreme temperatures and not usable. Adding this requirement would extend system runtime capabilities during power outages and reduce the transportation load on refueling companies responding to severe weather events. However, this change may impose additional requirements on large water systems, including registration for above-ground storage tanks in the amount of 1,100 gallons or more. Additionally, expired fuel may need to be disposed of in a particular way to comply with hazardous waste regulations. Entities would be required to have spill prevention, control, and countermeasure plans if they store more than 1,320 gallons above ground and more than 42,000 gallons below ground. For the above-ground containers, only tanks containing more than 55 gallons count towards that 1,320 gallon threshold. This change would require statutory authority to implement. Due to the potential costs and additional regulatory requirements associated with this change, the project team's preferred approach is to recommend that the agency seek additional stakeholder input to determine whether this should be included as a final recommendation. And again, out of all the conversations we had, this one really merited long-winded discussions. And frankly, right now, currently, our rules require 8 hours. I think we're all grappling with the fact that we didn't think that was enough. But if you look at how we could have extended the fuel supply for a week, that's not reasonable either. And so we're trying to land somewhere in the middle ground that's still acceptable to most water utilities. But there are some complications with that being a requirement.
Seeking more input. I mean, I'd love to hear from people on this one myself. How do y'all plan on, another stakeholder meeting, something at the conference? What would be your plan of action to get that input?
Usually we could seek additional stakeholder, but generally we have these discussions in our drinking water advisory work groups.
Great.
So we've got folks for the industry that come to those and we kind of hash out these kinds of issues,
Yeah.
see where we land.
And commissioners, y'all may recall during the after storm work session that we had in March, we had some of the systems that had successes, and they came and talked about successes and things that didn't work so well. You may recall City of Round Rock went the entire duration without any impacts to their water supply. However, they did talk about the challenge of getting fuel on site because the roads were icy and they had challenges getting there. So something to think.
Yeah, there could be another event where 72 hours is not enough time, but
Another option they threw around was 48. So we've kind of talking about that 48 to 72 hour threshold is somewhere for discussion.
Sure. Karen Michelle, can I say something to your point?
Sure.
Yes, we looked at just kind of a tidbit of information on fuel storage for generators. For those of you guys who may not be familiar, is that a lot of the generators have belly tanks on them that are double wall containment, but the baseline model, like if you go get a car, it's similar to that, but the baseline model pretty much gives you 24 hours running at 100% load. And there are options that are, you know, the most popular options are 24 and 48. So that being said, that may already be, most individuals may already have, you know, that 48 hours capability. It would be nice to, you know, we have EPPs, people submitting EPPs, so it kind of gives you an idea of how much fuel storage they have, and that's a good data analytic to look at to see kind of where we are in terms of what systems already have and what the impact may be. So, but
So if the ultimate requirement is 48 hours, then a lot of utilities could just buy the model of generator with the 48-hour belly tank, and they would not have to have an auxiliary tank with a secondary containment and have that added expense, I guess.
that's correct,
Yeah.
Commissioner, because and that's why the costs are so variable, because you know, if you can get away with the belly tank that's double wall containment, then you kind of get away from the, you know, the other stringent requirements that follow.
Unrelated question, is gravity feed any substitute for a generator, or even if you have an elevated tank, you still need a generator?
Sure. So in the rules currently, if you meet the trigger to require a generator, one of the outs is having enough, a certain threshold of elevated storage to gravity feed. But it's not, I don't think it's 72 hours. Yeah. It's more of a gallons per connection thing than a time thing,
Generally, they shoot for 24.
generally.
Okay, but it is a viable alternative to,
Yes.
it proved itself reliable, at least for a certain number of hours in this last storm event. Yeah, okay. I'm all for more stakeholder input on this.
All right, our second recommendation. This is to enhance the requirements of Senate Bill 3 through agency rulemaking. And this is to specify when revisions to emergency preparedness plans are required. Example of this would be, we had a lot of folks who changed their treatment processes. Well, the EPP didn't get revised, and so it didn't follow suit with what they were actually doing out at the plant, and so we'll need to incorporate that they'll need to submit that when they make those types of changes. We also want to specify when revisions are required if a plan fails to provide 20 PSI after an extended power outage. We're currently still working with the Harris and Fort Bend counties who have previously had the requirement of submitting an emergency preparedness plan. And of course, for those folks in those counties, because they went on boil water notices or had other infrastructure problems, we've now requested that they submit, you know, some type of revision or let us know if they fixed that issue, or that if it's something more that would create a revision in the emergency preparedness plan. So we'll look for something to put that when we do agency rulemaking on Senate Bill 3. The other thing that we feel that we need to provide clarification on is the wholesale and purchase system relationships to determine when the requirements are applicable, okay? And because those relationships are special and not really geared, there's a whole lot of conversations we're having with them to determine who actually is going to be the responsible party that has to submit the emergency preparedness plan. So we'll put a little bit more context in our rules so that that's a little clearer when those decisions have to be made about what's applicable. Our eighth recommendation, we'll move on if you don't have any questions, is to expand the requirements for what must be included in a systems plant operations manual. So a pervasive theme throughout our literature review was that having a robust and usable plant operations manual is essential for improving water system resiliency. We'd revised Chapter 290 rules to require specific protocols to be included in the plant operations manual to help ensure continuity of operations. This will assist new operators or visiting operators who are not familiar with the treatment plant. And we run into this every day, and particularly in Winter Storm Uri, we had utility crews come out and try to help systems, and unfortunately, all that equipment is not necessarily intuitive for the operators to manage. They didn't know where things were, there were no instructions, so we've got to be better about writing it down. The other problem that we see is that we've got a lot of our operators, unfortunately, at retirement age, and their manuals are in between their ears and they're walking out the door. And so we really want to focus on getting those down and having good manuals to use for each of the treatment plants. Also will help our Texas Optimization Program folks when they go out on an emergency to try to figure out very quickly how to help the system when they've got some things that they need to know. So we'll talk about a few examples of the items that, it's not exclusive, but certainly the types of things we're looking at. Instructions for both normal and emergency operations. Instructions for both automated and manual operations. Troubleshooting guidelines, potential hazards associated with critical component operations. Information for our water systems chemical and instrumentation vendors. A schedule for or a last date of preventative maintenance on plant equipment. And the location of where to purchase replacement parts. We'll draft guidance to assist water systems with developing the additional protocols in their plant operations manual. And then we'll go from there in terms of providing assistance and maybe get them thinking about what actually they need to have down on paper for a good manual.
If someone doesn't have the manual with the new requirements, which I like all of, is that an NOV? I mean, is that the level of, I don't know, disciplinary action we would take? I'm just looking at what we would do to make sure people have them.
So currently in the rules, there is a regulation for the requirement to have the plant operations manual, and when they don't provide that, that would result in a violation. And so
Okay.
if it's a similar situation, it would have a similar result with the new
Okay.
requirements.
I think currently, right now, we're just not very aggressive about what has to be included. We want
Yeah.
the systems, the ability, it's their system. They know how to run their systems best. We're just trying to fill a gap where we've seen some things, and some might not know that all these things really are good to have down on paper. And so we're just trying to strengthen those manuals.
Yeah.
An additional thought I was thinking about, you mentioned the vendors, identify the vendors where you get the parts, and maybe this is already part of the manual, but also having a part number list so you can identify the part. And I wouldn't have this be a requirement necessarily, but a suggestion that operators think ahead about the availability of those parts and the lead time, the just-in-time inventory world that we were all spoiled by a few years ago seems a little bit more shaky and reliable. I mean, some things you can get from Amazon in an hour, but I would imagine important components for a water supply system are not often among those. So if it's not already in there, some forethought into, should I have a spare part sitting here, for a potential failure?
And also recognizing secondary vendors, problems happen with vendors too. And so understanding where you can also go in case the first one fails or doesn't have it, or shipping is going to be 8 months, is always a good idea to look for a secondary.
Very good point.
Okay, our 9th recommendation is to add a requirement that water systems must protect critical components from adverse weather conditions. So stakeholders noted that severe weather had a direct impact on their ability to continue operations. Primarily exposed chemical feed lines, certain valves, small water lines with stagnant water, and generators were impacted by the severe winter weather. Current Chapter 290 rules outline certain requirements requiring the protection of plant equipment from specific weather conditions, such as flooding, but very few pertain to freezing. We'll revise Chapter 290 rules to require protection for certain critical plant equipment from adverse weather conditions. We'll develop a definition for adverse weather events that include specific weather conditions, including flooding, freezing, high winds, high heat. Therefore, a water system will be generally required to provide holistic weatherization. Minimum system components will be identified for weatherization measures, including electrical components. However, the methods for weatherization will be described in guidance to account for needed flexibility based on site-specific conditions and the extreme weather variations across the state. So this was another big one, and one I think where there's a lot of cost concerns. There's also, folks up in Abilene take care of weatherizing a little different than the folks in Corpus Christi. So we're trying to find the ability that the system will choose, how best to weatherize, also based on their current budget. I think we're just looking that, we're thinking about those critical components and being aware of which ones could present critical problems in the event that they freeze or are affected by other weather conditions. Our 10th recommendation is to revise the current exception process to strengthen weatherization measures for entities requesting an exception to allow distribution piping to be exposed or buried less than 24 inches below ground surface. So high demand from water leaks played a significant role, as we've been talking about, and many water systems not being able to supply potable water during the winter storm. And a lot of the broken lines were because they were exposed or buried less than the required 24 inches. We see this a lot. There are a multitude of reasons why somebody can't bury at 24 inches. Usually we'll see it if they need to go across a bridge because they can't dredge underneath water, or it's a temporary line and it's got to be above ground for a while. We'll revise the current exceptions policy to increase protective measures of exposed lines from systems requesting to not meet the minimum line burial requirements. And this will also allow us to designate site-specific conditions that are appropriate for the variations in climate across the state. Generally, when we set those exceptions, we'll set conditions, and those are enforceable. And so if they don't follow the conditions in the exception, that we'll have the opportunity to make sure that that's addressed and those violations get resolved. Other than that, I think that this is a good solution to trying to figure out how we're going to deal with the folks up north and the folks down south in terms of finding some common middle ground. Our final optional idea for a recommendation also relates to weatherization, and this is adding a definition and rule for the term of all weather access road. And this is to clarify standards for the path to water facilities for accessibility in all weather conditions. This idea for a recommendation was less of an issue discussed by stakeholders, but discussed within the project team. Much of the concern stemmed from bad experiences with the roads to plants during emergency events. Members of the project team expressed concern that the drinking water rules did not particularly specify what was required to be able to evaluate accessibility to the plant. And certainly after having several discussions about what constituted an all-weather access road and the potential for significant costs for systems to comply, I think the team eventually landed on developing guidance and best management practices to retain access to the treatment plant. And we'd also like to include that in our guidance in our emergency preparedness manual that we talked about in recommendation number 5. Our 11th recommendation, this one's a big one. We want to enhance communication during an emergency event. And this would be to require public water systems to establish a public education program to provide information to their customers on how to prepare for and respond to water system and other related emergencies. Stakeholders reported that customer plumbing leaks, excessive dripping, and hoarding of water played a big role in the increased demand on water systems, which increased water outages. Stakeholders also discussed the significant volume of calls from customers who were concerned about water quality and what they were supposed to do. As Brittany mentioned earlier, systems had many frustrated and panicked customers who did not receive information about what they were required to do during that week and during other emergencies. So water systems would be required to convey information, such as how the system's going to communicate information during an emergency situation, also where boil water notices are going to be posted if one has been issued, instructions for boiling water and other safety measures, and what customers can do to limit impacts to their property and water loss. The educational material would be required to be delivered to all new customers before service is provided, as well as annually for all customers, but the delivery method will be flexible enough for water systems to do what's best for their system. Systems will be required to certify to the agency that the public education requirement was met. will develop a template and education materials for water systems to provide to their customers, which then can be tailored for individual systems. If considered, this change will require statutory authority to implement. We do not have a current public education requirement for this type of information that we have the authority to have. You know, I think we had a lot of folks voice communication problems. They didn't know where to look for boil water notices. They didn't know what they meant. There was a lot of panic. They didn't get anybody on the phone in the offices because everybody was out trying to resolve infrastructure issues, which made it worse. And so we're hoping that this at least will get together, decide, we'll work with stakeholders, talk about what they want to communicate. It's not always the best time to communicate and give folks the basic information during an emergency. So we're hoping to alleviate a little bit by providing some information. Our 12th recommendation involves making changes to the boil water notice requirements in Chapter 290. Stakeholders initiated multiple discussions about the boil water notice rules and the procedures for issuing and rescinding boil water notices. Many systems who had to issue boil water notice for the first time struggled with the requirements for how they were supposed to be issued and how they were supposed to be rescinded, along with what was required to be in the notices. Although we developed recommendations to change the rules in 290, it's not without potential limitations. The requirements for special precautions, protective measures, and boil water notices under 30 TAC 290-46Q are based on or relate to federal rules and include state added rules. Because the rules implicate federal requirements, any amendments that we make to the rules must be analyzed by EPA to avoid any impact on Texas's drinking water primacy. Before we start on any rulemaking activities concerning changes to the boil water notice requirements in response to the winter storm, we'll need to complete a detailed crosswalk between 290-46Q and any federal rule it implicates to ensure that no amendment under consideration will make a rule any less stringent than the federal requirements. And I kind of want to talk about this a little bit because of the concerns that we get about boil water notices and how they work. We mimic what the feds require them to do when something, you know, they have an E. coli sample that comes back positive. And there are certain language, certain requirements, certain ways. And what we struggle with the state added on is we don't want different procedures for a federal problem versus a state problem. That we think adds to the confusion. We do feel that there are some improvements we could make that potentially we could discuss with EPA that would benefit us here. And so we're going to take a first punch here at a few of them that we think we can talk about. But we do think there's room to talk about stakeholders and some of the procedures and at least provide them instructions and clarifications to help them how they can communicate with their customers so that we're not thinking, you know, that the water's going to kill us. And make sure that we're providing that information so we can be better about that and kind of take it out of the regulatory procedure and into the common sense practical approaches for when these things need to be issued. A few suggested changes, so we'll talk about those. First is to revise language in 290-46Q6, specifying the executive director approval of compliance documentation prior to rescinding a boil water notice. The language would be revised to specify the circumstances in which the executive director would need to review compliance documentation prior to rescinding the boil water notice. Stakeholders voiced concern about whether TCEQ approval was necessary prior to rescinding the boil water notice. This process created delays during the winter storm due to the scale of that event. And just to let you know, we probably had to review about 4,000 documents that week to try to get people rolling, and so it did create some delay. The clarification will provide a more streamlined boil water notice rescission process where water systems can lift the notice in most circumstances without submitting any prior compliance documentation for review by the agency. And again, there are going to be some circumstances where we'll want to see that, but we'll make sure that that's clear and they understand which circumstances that we don't. Another change we'd like is separating flushing requirements from disinfectant residual requirements in 29046Q6B. This change is being recommended to provide flexibility for water systems attempting to rescind a boil water notice and have met all the requirements to rescind the notice without needing to flush. This would allow water systems who are experiencing very high demand or drought conditions where water quantity is a concern to be able to skip flushing, if it is not critical due to the circumstances of the event. There will continue to be situations where flushing will still be required to provide acceptable water quality prior to rescinding a notice, and documentation for justifying the water system rescinding the notice must be retained to ensure all necessary actions were taken before rescinding the notice. We'd also like to add language to specify that boil water notice rescinds are to be provided to customers using the same method of delivery which were used for the issuance of the boil water notice. Believe it or not, but during the winter event, we had folks issuing it one way, we had them rescinding it in another, and unfortunately, customers were very confused because they were expecting one way, so they thought they were still on a boil water notice when it had already been rescinded. So hopefully this will provide a little bit more clarification and understanding of where to look if a rescind notice is issued and be able to determine if they are still under a boil water notice. We'd like to add language to clarify the requirements for minimum required coordination between wholesale and purchase systems, also called a consecutive system, and specify minimum actions the purchase system must take during a boil water notice. This change is being recommended to provide clarification to the roles and responsibilities of the wholesaler and the purchaser for issuing and rescinding boil water notices. I'd like to add language in 290-103 to clarify what constitutes a physical and hydraulic isolation to determine what areas of the distribution system or if downstream customers do or do not need to issue a boil water notice during a potential or actual water contamination event. Stakeholders requested that agency clarify the boil water notice issue procedures to eliminate having to issue a boil water notice for non-impacted areas, or only had to issue a boil water notice because the wholesaler issued a notice. We do, as I stated earlier, believe there are additional efficiencies to be evaluated to streamline the boil water notice issuance, rescission, and submittal procedures, and recommend continuing to work with internal and external stakeholders prior to initiating any rulemaking on this and prior talking to EPA.
And there's a system mapping conversation to be had around this too, right?
Yes.
Maybe I can just leave it at that. Yes.
And I'll say this is more for us too.
Yeah.
Okay. Every time we get into these emergency situations, we're having long conversations that start usually at about 4:45 on Friday. And we have to work through the night to try to figure out how to exclude certain areas from boil water notices because we need data to show that water didn't flow into those areas and that's protected. And sometimes that's not always hard to do. Usually it takes hydraulic models, you have to know where your valves are working and where flow works. Hopefully this will prepare them that if they want that option, that they're going to understand what data they need to produce so that our engineers aren't scrambling and working long hours trying to figure out what's in and what's not in. We always edge on the side of safety, and certainly when time is a factor, the last thing we want to do is sit here and kind of have long engineering discussions about what should be happening. And so we have to act quickly. And so I think that's going to help a little bit for them to be prepared. Here's what you need to be prepared for, and we need to move fast so that we can get this thing issued. Got two more recommendations. These are kind of no-brainers for us, and so we'll very quickly finish up here. Our 13th recommendation is to increase our outreach efforts to encourage participation and registration for mutual aid. This one was kind of surprising to us because approximately half of the survey respondents indicated that they don't have a mutual aid agreement. And, we're big proponents of mutual aid, and It offers a network for water systems to request a wide variety of assistance through the Texas Water and Wastewater Agency Response Network. These agreements can reduce emergency planning and response costs by providing a means for utilities to avoid owning and maintaining emergency response and recovery equipment. The agreements provide a means to effectively move equipment and crews between utilities during incidents. Agreements also facilitate pre-planning activities, including the identification of essential activities, key resources, communication protocols, and other planning activities. They also allow for the coordination of response and recovery activities between, utilities, agencies. That facilitates that conversation. Agreements facilitate other types of coordinations between the water sector and other independent sectors, including emergency services, energy, and public health sectors. So the Water Supply Division will look for opportunities to promote mutual aid agreements to increase system resiliency, and will ensure that systems are aware of this free resiliency tool. Going back to our funding question, our 14th recommendation is to increase coordination with funding agencies to identify processes for supporting weatherization needs and help make this information more readily available. We'll develop additional information resources on funding opportunities to distribute to water systems and coordinate with other state and federal funding agencies, trade organizations, and technical assistance providers and local officials to identify available funding sources. We'll also strengthen assistance to help systems understand and walk through funding application processes, and that's a big one. We'll coordinate with our partner agencies to develop resiliency-focused training events for water and wastewater system operators and the decision makers, assistance providers, and engineering and financial consultants and local officials. Particularly with the bipartisan infrastructure law that came down, one of the things is, consistently we've had conversations with EPA that they have to make the process easier, okay? Or we have to do a better job of helping systems understand what they have to do before they come to the table and have that information ready. Usually they'll get to that first step, they'll say, I want to apply, they'll intend, we'll get to that, and then the second step kind of hits them over the head because they weren't prepared with all the things that they have to have in order to get that funding approved. And so I think we'll make more of an effort on the funding side to get them walk through that process and really work with our technical assistance providers to focus on that a little bit more. We want people to come in, we want people to upgrade their infrastructure. It's not lost on us that that is needed, and so we'll help them get through that process. That concludes our recommendations. The project team is available to answer any questions you may have or to provide additional background needed for any of our recommendations.
Thank you, Carrie Michelle. Appreciate that. Colleagues, comments, questions?
I guess we probably need to talk about next step, and I'll just say kind of on all these recommendations where my head is at right now. And again, for anyone listening in, not here today, I would really like to hear from stakeholders on a lot of this stuff, but I'm on the page of if it needs to be done, that's what we need to do, even if that's going to be a cost. And people are going to not be pleased about that type of comment, but I just, as we always do, we put safety first, right? And so I think a lot of these things hopefully won't be well, I shouldn't say that. Some of these might be very costly for some very small systems if we choose to go that route. But I'm just more on the page if it needs to be done, that's going to carry more weight with me than cost, which is not probably normally how I think, but that's kind of how I feel right now. But I do think there are a lot of things y'all have already done. I think you've gotten very creative and put a lot of thought into these recommendations and done a very, very good job of being conscious of the costs that some of these could have on people. And so I'm not looking to run up the bill in any way, but I think as a regulatory agency, we have to, seriously consider what we're regulating here and put more weight on that. So anyway, I'll stop there, but I know we also need to talk about, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the game plan moving forward as well.
Yeah, let me pile on to the cost thing. I think it's probably pretty clear to everybody in the room that we have not, ratepayers at different systems have not been paying enough for their drinking water. And weatherization is just a part of that. And if we're going to have the drinking water systems that we need moving into the future, somehow we're going to have to communicate to the users of the water, you know, the value of that and why it's going to be important to pay more. As much as it pains me to say that, and it's not just weatherization; it's deferred maintenance, it's you know, infrastructure that's at the end of its life, and you know, fortunately, the federal funding, you know, it's an unprecedented opportunity to help out with some capital expenses, but there are going to be expenses out into the future for operations and maintenance that money is not going to cover, and you know, loaded into all that are sort of existing issues around, you know, how do we keep operators employed at these systems? We have a problem with a lack of operators and high turnover. You know, the whole background contaminants, emerging contaminants, lead and copper. I mean, it just goes on. And you know, we have a pretty good system now. There's a lot of room for improvement. And we're just going to need to invest to achieve those improvements, I think.
I'm in full agreement. I think that at this time, erring on the side of need over immediate concerns of cost will unfortunately need to be the prevailing guide star we look to. And I think that as y'all continue to very thoughtfully evaluate where your tools with each of these recommendations impact the users, not just the systems themselves, but where that will translate into costs that trickles on down to the ratepayers, and where we will expect fully to hear from unhappy Texans finding that water is much more expensive than we all realized. I think that that's a conversation we're necessarily going to need to just engage in and look to the flexibility we have and juxtapose that up against the limitations of reality. So, okay, we are sitting on a powder keg of a whole bunch of underfunded, under-repaired, under-resourced systems with very ambitious emergency plans that are coming in with some dates that are a little further out than the ratepayers in those systems are comfortable with. And these are all just increasingly uncomfortable realities we're becoming better aware of. And I don't want to see the water component that feeds into the state's power resiliency unattended to because of our hesitance around those costs. I think we need to raise the flag and say there's simply not the resource available now, and where the ratepayers will come up short or where state funding programs disconnect with those existing needs. I think that's where we need to be continually looking into the depths of these questions so that we can really help provide that assurance to policymakers where they're really reluctant to say, yep, let's embark on that cost. I'm really thrilled with all the extensive work. I wish that we had a few more hours today for this work session to pick apart every one of the recommendations. I suspect each one of those volunteers who took the primary responsibility for each one of these really did have a lot more that they could have shared today, and I'm thrilled at that new knowledge base we have. I hope nobody retires or leaves or goes to a different job in the agency until we solve the water resiliency problem.
You've been told.
I hope, but I think I'm in the same position.
In terms of next steps, great question. I think we've provided, you know, some of our thoughts and guidance on individual pieces in terms of stakeholder processes and that sort of thing, and contemplated future rulemakings. But what guidance are you needing from us on steps forward, if any?
Yeah.
For us, you know, I think we need to think about what we're going to get into our rulemaking package, especially with our Senate Bill 3 requirements, because we'll get going on that here at the end of the summer. And so hopefully by that time, we'll understand what we want to include in that package. I think we do need some more work on boil water notices. We're certainly probably in more likelihood not going to get that crosswalk and a response back from EPA that we can move forward with those changes or anything else that we propose. So that may be another segment. We do have some other changes in Chapter 290 rules that we've been kind of waiting to do, that we have a fix. Unfortunately, every time we get ready to do that package, a federal rule comes down and we get torn around, and that will happen again to us when lead and copper rule revisions finalize and come out again with a new rule. And so I think trying to find the timing and the best way to do this, there are definitely some of those ideas we would want more stakeholder feedback for, so that we get a variety of systems and some of the complications that, you know, that these recommendations are going to present, because we might not have heard from anyone that might have an additional idea that we need to think about. And so that we'd like more time, but certainly the areas where we're feeling comfortable with moving forward and including what we can in this rule package here in late summer to get this rolling and get some of those generator requirements, those kinds of things, get moving on that so we can get that in rule.
So, I mean, it sounds like there's multiple pieces, right? There's, you know, the first however many, 6 or so recommendations, it's a lot of manual training, and so that's on one track, right? And I know y'all are working on that, and I'm not pressuring you to move faster on that track at all. And the next track is probably the heavier lift, and that's a 290 chapter rule upgrade. This is easy for me to say because I'm not the one working on it, but I kind of want to see us, again, with the thought of end of summer, you know, I'm not saying today or tomorrow, but start moving forward on whatever the SP3 requirements are that we need to do, and knowing that there could be lead and copper stuff that comes down. You know, I don't want to wait on it to come down before we do 290 rulemaking. If there's things that were required in Senate Bill 3 that we need to go ahead and get moving on. That's probably the best way to say it. I hate for y'all to have to do 2 rulemakings, you know, knowing a federal rule could come out, but I mean, are they going to be on time? You know, I don't want this to get delayed because we're waiting on. I think you get my point. So I'll stop there. And then I don't know. I have these ideas swirling in my head. I'm not going to go through all of them right now, but you know, maybe there's a way us commissioners can have conversations with EPA or the board and try and push there or get creative there. So let me ask this. You mentioned just a second ago, you've already, I think you used the term crosswalk, but is it something you've had discussions with EPA on, you're waiting to get an answer on, or you've pushed something up for an approval?
I think
What do we need from EPA? Do we just need to have a conversation, or have we already floated stuff and we're waiting to hear back?
I've had a preliminary discussion
Okay.
with them, and they've presented what they'd like to see to make sure that whatever we decide as a state and changing our rules, they just want to make sure that it's not infringing on primacy requirements. So once you guys are okay with the changes that we've made, I think in terms of processes and procedures, as long as we're not changing the intent of the rule, we can work with stakeholders all day long to try to figure out how we're going to streamline that process and make it easier for them and the customers. That might not necessarily take a rule change, but some of the things that we're looking at for some quick fixes to the issues that we saw in Winter Storm, that we can do. That will just have to be a separate rulemaking project. Again, if we can get that information back from EPA, that potentially could be included, but right now we're just focusing on those emergency response activities that we want to get in the SB3 rule package to get those in our rules. And we'll put in there what we can, especially with our discussion if you want to move forward with those. But the boil water notice is the
big one, yeah.
the one that's a little off-center.
And Karen Michelle, one thing I would like to add, and Commissioners, there were some optional items presented that we were going to seek further stakeholder input on. Would y'all like us to get back in front of you once those have been resolved, or?
That was my conclusion, is that we have several work sessions ahead of us as you all are moving forward on the different fronts in terms of curriculum and guidance and rulemaking. Let's get together again and bounce ideas and see where we are with the stakeholder processes.
Yeah, I think with training and getting those first 5 or 6 key ones, we've got that in hand. We'll get working on that. I think that's the most important, is to get that out and start working with our operators. Then work on the rule, what we can include in the SB3 package, work with stakeholders on the optional ideas, And then as far as processes within internally, agency-wise, I think we can do that separately just to work through our administrative business processes to make that easier for folks. So I don't think we'll need to talk about that again, but certainly the optional ideas and getting feedback from them and looking for other complications would be a good idea.
So timing wise, I don't know what we're thinking. Y'all, the EPPs, you're, busting your what, working on those right now. What's the time, remind me again of the timeline. You're hoping to kind of get those completed in July?
Well,
No pressure. You just,
I'll talk a little bit about that. So, we're expecting about 4,000 to roll in. And so
they do, maybe that's what I'm thinking of.
March 1st.
Okay, that's what I thought.
And then they'll have to start implementing them in July.
Okay.
And kind of what our thought here is, we really need to focus on those requirements
Yeah.
and getting them through those plans. And for those that didn't submit plans,
Yep.
contacting them and working them through that process. And so a lot of the folks that are included in that process also will be working
Right.
on these things. So we'll try to do things consecutively in parallel as much as we can, but again, we're focused on getting through all those EPPs and getting them compliant so that the regional folks can check on those when the implementation deadline rolls around, make sure that they've got them in place.
Michelle, what's the current universe on EPPs turned into us relative to the total number?
I think we've got, I want to say about 2,000 that are EPPs, but total submittals, we've gotten over 3,000. And of course, that makes up with extension requests, financial waivers, other things that are not exactly the EPPs that they turn in for approval. And Brittany, if you want to add anything to that, since Brittany is managing that on top of everything else that she's doing, so.
No, those numbers are about right. We've received about a little over 2,000, I believe, EPPs specifically. And we're now, I believe, I've heard from my team leader, starting to get the request for implementation extensions. So we're getting more submittals every day. So.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question, maybe. So in order for y'all, do you need anything from us before you can start working on a rule submittal package, 290 changes? Do we need to circle up and have a work session before then? Or do you all feel like you have enough guidance that you could, I'm just trying to figure out if we need to get together before that or not.
I think so, because I think especially on the 72-hour fuel requirement, we
Yeah.
want some feedback on that to include in that rulemaking package. I think we're looking at those being, emergency response activities, and so they bode well with the Senate Bill 3 requirements and those kinds of things. So we'll be looking for that, so we'll have to get talking with our stakeholders and trying to get a consensus to present to you about how we're feeling about that, and then make a decision on whether or not that'll be in that rule package or not.
That's helpful, yeah.
So a summer work session?
Commissioner, also to add to that, and this is sort of when you asked about roles, one of the things that I'd just like to bring up is the idea of legislative outreach.
Yep.
Obviously, I think both of y'all alluded, or all three of you alluded to maybe some costs,
Yep.
resource constraints, and where I think y'all could be really helpful is in taking that message downtown.
Happy to. I don't necessarily want to put a hard date on when to meet again. Y'all kind of tell us when you're ready is what I would say. And, we always have a work session planned. I don't think we need to meet next month. Doesn't sound like that would be very productive, but I'd say after that, ED office, let us know when's helpful. That's just my 2 cents, knowing that we do all want to get moving on something, and I don't want us to be a holdup in any way. So I want to make sure we have a work session if that's what we need in order to move anything forward if it's needed.
And there are several on the calendar, and
Yeah.
we can schedule. So just say when you're ready to hear from us, and we'll find a time to meet.
And we already know what the majority of that rule package is going to be, and so we'll start working on that, and then work in that inclusion after we've had those discussions and you get a little bit more data about how people are feeling about those optional ideas.
Yeah. And, you know, Toby made a good point. If there are any statutory changes, you know, would like some lead-in time before session, right? I think the members would appreciate that too, so, you know, along with the EPPs and other things
And we
going
can
on.
do those, you know, we can draft those out as statutory recommendations when that time comes, and then you guys can make that decision on whether or not you want to move forward. So that's the separate path on that as well.
Great. Any other final thoughts? Well, Carrie, Michelle, Brittany, thank
Yeah.
you very much for the presentation, and thank you and everyone for the enormous amount of work that has gone into this
Yes.
already. Great work. We really appreciate it. There's a lot of great work left to be done, clearly.
This is phase one.
Of perhaps several, but thanks for the presentation and everything that you're doing. I feel like we're moving to a better place, and
Yeah, this
you
sounds
just
real.
have our appreciation.
Yeah, it's real cheesy to say, but I genuinely feel that this is really important for Texans. I mean, we're doing something, we're going to be putting things in place that will help every person in this state. Hopefully it won't have to be, hopefully there's no winter storm ever again, but these are really, they're small, but they're substantial in our everyday lives, and people that are working on it are just the absolute best. So thanks to y'all, and we've kept y'all here long enough. I'm about ready for a hot dog.
Same.
Well, hot dog.
Toby, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Just first of all, I wanted to thank y'all and having the foresight to ask for this after, in the wake of Winter Storm Uri. I think we all knew the legislature was going to do something, and I think this is a really nice complement to what the foundation that they have laid. I heard some things here today that I thought were really interesting, and Commissioner Lindley, your point about infrastructure and the definition of infrastructure, I think is really important. And I was over here quickly trying to read federal definitions of infrastructure, and I could argue right now that generators and maintenance fall directly into that definition. And so you asked for roles. Another role that I could see is interfacing directly with, whether it's EPA, it might be OMB, on how if that money can fall into, you know, if we can use the, you know, these those infrastructure dollars for things like this. So I think that would be that might be needed. As far as the training goes, Carrie, Michelle, we'll talk about it, but, you know, we do a fall conference, we do a water conference, we have trade fair. I think there's a lot of places we could put little nuggets of training that's easily accessible. But the other thing I thought about with ICS and NIMS is typically you can't do that unless you have enough people sort of signed up for it. And I think regional offices, we need to talk about possibly trying to host some of those. If we can get enough small systems interested, then we can take it to them and try to serve as a partner in making those connections for those systems. The last thing I'd like to do, there's two things. First of all, to all the staff members and members who are joining us virtually right now, thank you so much from the legislature. Thank you for being engaged. I'd also like to recognize Amy Lopez from the Lieutenant Governor's Office. Thank you for being here today. We really appreciate it. And then finally, our staff who took this this charge from y'all and really ran with it. And I think, to Commissioner Lindley's point, has produced, I think, something that's really meaningful for the state, and I think could really change the trajectory going forward. While it's not going to keep a winter storm from happening, I think it will put us in a better place to be able to react and deal with that. So anyway, thank you so much for that. And then finally, just there is a lunch outside after this. Out in the parking lot, so please come join us, and any TCQ staff who's watching, it's open to all of y'all. So thank you.
Thank you, Toby. I think that's a great place to end if there are no objections. All right. Seeing none, what time do we have?
I'm going to call the executive session
Oh,
items.
that's right. We have additional items to call, and then we'll dispose of those real quickly.
Yes, items 2 through 5 are for a closed session, but the commission will obviously not be meeting in closed session today.
So the time is 11:14, and we are adjourned.